At the right arm of the free world. The workshop fell silent, except for the methodical sound of steel against steel. Dieudonné Saïve hunched over his workbench in the dim light of winter 1947, his calloused fingers tracing the contours of what would become the most influential rifle of the 20th century. Around him lay scattered blueprints, failed prototypes, and the weight of a world still bleeding from its second Great War. He was 53 years old, a Belgian gunsmith whose name meant nothing to generals or politicians, yet in his hands lay the power to arm half the planet. The FAL, Fusil Automatique Léger, waited to be born, and with it, a legacy that would reshape the very nature of modern warfare. Snow fell outside the Fabrique Nationale factory windows, accumulating on the cobblestones of Liège, just as it had during the German occupation. But this winter carried different possibilities. The Americans had come calling with their ambitious plans for NATO standardization, and Saïve saw more than just another military contract. He saw redemption for Belgium, vindication for his years of invisible labor, and perhaps most importantly, the chance to arm democracy itself. The crisis that drove Saïve's obsession had roots in the trenches of 2 world wars. European armies had watched helplessly as their bolt-action rifles became obsolete against semi-automatic weapons. The Germans had proven the devastating effectiveness of the STG-44 assault rifle, while the Americans had dominated Pacific beaches with their M1 Garands. But Europe's answer remained scattered, uncoordinated, inferior. NATO needed a universal weapon, something that could bridge the gap between the American .30-06 cartridge and the Soviet 7.62 39mm, something that could give the West a fighting chance in the Cold War arms race that was already freezing into doctrine. The British had their experimental 280 cartridge. The Americans insisted on their powerful .30-06, and the Belgians, small, overlooked Belgium, dared to believe they could solve what the superpowers could not. Saïve paused in his work, setting down his files and precision tools. On the corner of his workbench sat a simple metal cup, half filled with lukewarm coffee. Ersatz coffee, really, the bitter chicory blend that had sustained them through the occupation years. Even now, with the war over and real coffee beans trickling back into European markets, he couldn't bring himself to waste the good stuff on workshop breaks. The ersatz reminded him where he'd come from, what Belgium had endured, and why this project mattered more than any military contract had a right to. He lifted the cup and took a sip, wincing slightly at the familiar, acrid taste. Somewhere in that bitterness lay the memory of occupation, of watching German engineers study his high-power pistol designs, of seeing his life's work perverted to serve the Wehrmacht. The humiliation still burned, not just personal, but national. Belgium, eternally caught between great powers, had always been someone else's battleground, never the maker of its own destiny. But this rifle would change that. This rifle would arm the free world. The workshop door creaked open, and Henri Moreau, FN's chief engineer, stepped inside with a worried expression. The Americans are getting impatient, Dieudonné. They want to see real progress by spring. Saïve didn't look up from his blueprints. Let them be impatient. Good engineering doesn't follow diplomatic schedules. The British are pushing their EM2 harder now. They think their 280 round gives them an advantage. The British are thinking too small. They want to win the last war, not the next one. Moreau moved closer, lowering his voice. The board is asking questions. Some think we should stick to what we know. Pistols, hunting rifles, safe contracts. Now Saïve did look up, his eyes sharp despite the fatigue etched into his weathered face. Henri, I've spent my entire life in the shadows. Browning got credit for the high power, though I solved every problem that made it work. The Germans took my designs and never spoke my name. I won't let this opportunity pass, because frightened men prefer safe profits to history. He gestured to the scattered prototypes around the workshop, each representing months of 18-hour days, each failure teaching him something new about gas pressure, receiver stress, and the brutal realities of automatic fire. This rifle will work in Arctic snow and tropical mud. It will serve conscripts and professionals. It will be the weapon NATO needs, whether they're wise enough to recognize it or not. Moreau nodded slowly, understanding the deeper current beneath Saiv's words. This wasn't just about military contracts or national pride. This was about proving that genius could emerge from the smallest places, that innovation didn't require the resources of superpowers or the recognition of academies. As Moreau left, Saiv returned to his work, the sound of steel against steel resuming its rhythm. But his mind drifted to memories of his childhood in these same industrial streets of Liège, where the hammering of metal was the city's heartbeat, where a 12-year-old boy had learned to hear problems in the cycling of machinery that university-trained engineers couldn't detect. Outside, the snow continued to fall, and somewhere in laboratories across the Atlantic and in British workshops, other men worked on competing designs. But in this quiet Belgian factory, lit by a few bare bulbs and warmed by the stubborn determination of a craftsman who had survived 2 world wars, the future of modern warfare was taking shape, one careful modification at a time. If stories like this make you question what you'd do in someone else's boots, tell us in the comments how you imagine you'd react in this camp. And stay with us for the next chapters. How do you create something meant to protect freedom, knowing it might serve any master willing to pay? Dieudonné Saiv had been born into poverty in 1888 in the industrial heart of Liège, where the sound of hammering metal was the city's heartbeat. His father died when he was 12, leaving him to work in the Fabrique Nationale factories while other children attended school. But Saiv possessed something that couldn't be taught, an intuitive understanding of mechanical systems that bordered on the supernatural. He could hear problems in the cycling of a bolt, feel imperfections in the balance of a stock, visualize solutions that escaped university-trained engineers. The memories came to him now as he worked late into the night of February 1948, the workshop empty except for the ghosts of his past. He remembered the first time he'd held a rifle mechanism, age 14, when old Master Dubois had handed him a jammed bolt assembly from a Mauser. "Fix that, boy, if you can." Young Dieudonné hadn't needed diagrams or instruction manuals. His fingers had found the problem by feel, a microscopic burr on the firing pin channel that created just enough friction to bind the mechanism under rapid cycling. Dubois had stared at the repaired bolt for a full minute before speaking. "How did you know where to look?" "I listened to it, Master Dubois. The metal tells you what's wrong." By 30, he had already revolutionized the Browning high-power pistol, transforming John Moses Browning's final design into the most successful military sidearm in history. Yet recognition never came. He remained the quiet Belgian, the craftsman whose genius lived in shadows while others claimed the glory. The war years had scarred him deeper than any wound. He had watched German forces occupy his homeland, seen his life's work stolen and perverted to arm the Wehrmacht. Those memories still ambushed him in quiet moments. The sound of Wehrmacht officers discussing his high-power modifications in clinical German, the sight of his improved firing pin design being mass-produced in factories he'd never seen, for an army he despised. When the Americans approached FN in 1947 with their demand for a NATO standard rifle, Saiv saw more than a contract. He saw vindication. He saw the chance for Belgium to arm the free world. Working 18-hour days in a workshop that reeked of gun oil and disappointment, Saiv began with a radical premise. Forget everything the military thought it knew about automatic rifles. The FAL wouldn't be another incremental improvement. It would be a complete reimagining. He designed a gas-operated system so reliable it could function in Arctic snow or tropical mud. He crafted a rifle that was simultaneously rugged enough for conscripts and precise enough for professionals. Most audaciously, he made it modular, capable of serving as both a semi-automatic infantry weapon and a squad automatic weapon, depending on configuration. But progress came slowly, painfully. Each morning brought new challenges, new failures, new reasons for doubt. The coffee in his metal cup had grown cold again. How many times today? He'd lost count. The bitter ersatz reminded him of rationing, of deprivation, of the years when even basic materials were luxuries. Now he had access to the finest steel, the most precise machinery, the support of an entire factory, yet the essential problems remained maddeningly elusive. The first prototypes failed spectacularly. The gas system malfunctioned under stress testing. The receiver cracked when subjected to rapid-fire sequences. Military observers watched skeptically as Saiv's revolutionary rifle jammed, misfired, and broke apart during trials. Colonel Harrison from the American Procurement Office had been particularly blunt after a disastrous demonstration in March. "Mr. Saiv, with all due respect to your reputation, this weapon appears to suffer from fundamental design flaws. Perhaps FN should consider a more conventional approach." British officials, invested in their own EM2 rifle, dismissed the Belgian upstart with barely concealed satisfaction. Major Thornton from the British Small Arms Committee had smiled thinly during one particularly embarrassing malfunction. Quite ambitious, this Belgian effort. Though ambition and engineering excellence are rather different qualities, wouldn't you say? Even within FN, voices whispered that Saiv was attempting the impossible, creating a single weapon that could satisfy every army in the Western Alliance. Board members spoke in hushed tones about wasted resources, missed deadlines, and the growing impatience of their American partners. But Saiv possessed something his critics lacked: the patience of a craftsman and the stubbornness of a man who had survived 2 world wars in occupied territory. Each failure taught him something new. Each broken part revealed secrets about stress distribution, heat dissipation, and the violent physics of automatic fire. His notebook filled with observations, sketches, modifications. Gas port diameter, bolt face angle, buffer spring tension. Every variable mattered. Every detail contributed to the larger harmony he was trying to achieve. The rifle was becoming an extension of his own understanding, a physical manifestation of decades spent listening to the language of metal under stress. Late one evening in May, as spring rain drummed against the workshop windows, Saiv made a breakthrough. The problem wasn't the gas system itself. It was the interaction between gas pressure and bolt velocity under different ambient conditions. Temperature affected everything: the viscosity of lubricants, the expansion of metal components, the burn rate of propellant. His rifle needed to be self-adjusting, responsive to conditions no engineer could predict. He reached for his coffee cup, found it empty, and smiled despite his exhaustion. Tomorrow would bring new tests, new challenges, new opportunities to prove that small nations could create great things. The Americans might have their industrial might, the British their imperial experience, but Belgium had something rarer: the stubborn genius of a man who refused to accept that anything was impossible. Outside, the rain continued, and in the distance, the lights of Liège glowed through the darkness, the same lights that had hidden under blackout curtains during the occupation, the same city that had endured and survived. Like the rifle taking shape on his workbench, Belgium itself was more resilient than anyone imagined. What happens when your life's work becomes a tool for forces you can't control? Night after night, through the summer of 1949, Saiv refined the gas system, strengthened the receiver, perfected the balance. He studied every failure like a detective examining evidence, each broken part revealing secrets about stress, heat, and human nature. The workshop became his monastery, The rhythmic sound of steel against steel, his prayer. The bitter coffee, his communion wine, connecting him to years of struggle and determination. Letters from his sister Marie arrived weekly from their childhood neighborhood, carrying news that reminded him how much was at stake beyond military contracts and engineering pride. The Korean conflict was escalating, and young Belgian men were talking about NATO deployments. His nephew Paul, barely 20, had joined the army and might soon carry whatever rifle emerged from this international competition. "Uncle Dieudonné," Marie wrote in her careful script, "Paul says the old rifles are no match for what the communists have now. He says American weapons are better, but he wishes Belgium made something he could be proud to carry. He asks about your work, though I tell him I know nothing of such things. Perhaps you could write to him?" Save folded the letter carefully and placed it beside his coffee cup. Paul had never known the occupation years, had grown up in liberated Belgium, where American jazz played on the radio and Coca-Cola appeared in shop windows. The boy couldn't understand the weight of history that pressed down on this project, the burden of proving that small nations could shape their own destiny. The breakthrough came in August 1950 during a midnight test session. The rifle that had refused to fire 50 rounds without jamming suddenly cycled through 500 rounds flawlessly. The sound echoed through the empty workshop like a prayer answered, steady, rhythmic, reliable as a heartbeat. Saïv stood transfixed, watching brass cases arc through the air under the harsh fluorescent lights, each ejection perfect, each reload seamless. He set down the weapon with trembling hands and reached for his coffee cup, only to find it empty. For the first time in months, he didn't notice the taste of ersatz versus real coffee. The rifle worked. After 3 years of 18-hour days, after countless failures and modifications, after enduring skepticism from Americans and condescension from British officials, he had created something truly revolutionary. Henri Moreau arrived at dawn to find Saïv still in the workshop, surrounded by empty shell casings and filled with quiet satisfaction. "It works, Henri. All night, not a single malfunction." "How many rounds?" "I stopped counting at 800. The barrel was too hot to touch, but the mechanism never faltered." Word spread quickly through FN headquarters, then to Brussels, then across the Atlantic to Pentagon procurement offices. Within weeks, NATO officials were demanding demonstrations. The rifle that had been dismissed as an ambitious failure was suddenly the most promising candidate for Western standardization. When NATO officially adopted the 7.62 p/2 cartridge as standard in early 1951, Saïv's rifle was ready. The FN FAL adapted perfectly to the new ammunition, while competing designs struggled with the transition. Orders poured in from Britain, Canada, Australia, West Germany, and then beyond NATO to Argentina, Brazil, Israel, South Africa. Colonel Harrison, the American officer who had questioned the fundamental design just 2 years earlier, now spoke with barely contained enthusiasm. "Mr. Saïv, this weapon exceeds every specification we established. It may well become the backbone of Western defense for the next generation." But success brought unexpected weight. In his small apartment above the workshop, Saïv read intelligence reports about communist weapons development, studied maps of global tension points where his rifle might soon be deployed. The theoretical had become terrifyingly real. Young men like his nephew Paul would carry these weapons into jungles and mountains, deserts and cities, places Saïv could barely imagine. By the 1960s, the rifle Saïv had conceived in post-war desperation was serving in jungles, deserts and cities across 5 continents. British paratroopers carried it into Suez, Israeli soldiers wielded it in the Six-Day War, and Argentine conscripts bore it into the Falklands. The right arm of the free world, as marketing materials proudly proclaimed, had become exactly what Saïv had envisioned, the universal weapon of democratic armies. Yet, with each news report, each photograph of soldiers carrying his creation into battle, Saeed felt the growing complexity of his achievement. The rifle designed to arm democracy was spreading far beyond democratic armies. Military advisors shipped FALs to any government willing to align with Western interests, regardless of their commitment to freedom or human rights. Marie's letters continued to arrive, now carrying news of Paul's deployment to the Congo with Belgian peacekeeping forces. "He writes that his unit carries the rifles you designed," she reported. "He says it makes him proud to know his uncle's work protects him. But the news from Africa is troubling, and I pray this weapon brings him home safely." Saif folded that letter and placed it with the others, a growing collection of reminders that engineering decisions had human consequences extending far beyond the workshop. The boy who had learned to listen to metal speaking its needs had created something that would outlive him, serving masters and causes he could never predict or control. Do you think you'd cling to what you were taught back home, or to what your own eyes see in a place like this? Comment which side you'd lean toward, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. Can an inventor remain innocent once the world takes hold of his creation? The 1960s brought Saïva both triumph and torment. Production lines hummed with constant activity as orders flowed in from every corner of the democratic world and beyond. The FAL had become ubiquitous, the rifle that armed NATO armies, Commonwealth forces, and dozens of allied nations. In the factory corridors where he had once labored in obscurity, Saïv now walked as a legend, acknowledged at last as the creator of the century's most influential small arm. Yet the recognition felt hollow when measured against the weight of unintended consequences. Television news brought images of his rifle in conflicts he had never imagined. Civil wars, coups, interventions that seemed to blur the line between liberation and occupation. The weapon designed to defend democracy was serving any cause that could pay the licensing fees or purchase surplus stocks. Dr. Elizabeth Rousseau, a Red Cross coordinator who occasionally visited the factory to discuss medical equipment contracts, noticed Saïv's growing melancholy during their conversations. "You seem troubled, Mr. Saïv. One might think success would bring more satisfaction." "Success in engineering is precise, Dr. Rousseau. You solve a problem and it stays solved. Success in human affairs is more complicated." They sat in the factory cafeteria, sharing the simple lunch that Saïva preferred, despite his newfound ability to afford better. He still drank ersatz coffee from his old metal cup, still carried the habits of wartime scarcity, even as wealth accumulated in bank accounts he rarely consulted. "The rifle works exactly as I designed it," he continued. "Reliable, accurate, adaptable to any climate or condition. But I designed it for NATO armies defending democracy. Now I read reports of it being used by dictators, by governments that suppress their own people, by armies fighting wars I don't understand for causes I cannot support." Dr. Rousseau nodded thoughtfully. She had seen enough of human conflict to understand the moral complexity that haunted creators of military technology. "Did you expect to control how it would be used?" I hoped it would serve only just causes. Naive, perhaps, but engineers tend toward optimism about human nature. The medical supplies we distribute often end up treating soldiers on both sides of conflicts. Should we stop producing antibiotics because they might save the life of a dictator? Saïv considered this, sipping his bitter coffee while watching workers pass by, with the quiet efficiency that had made Belgium's industrial reputation. Outside, the modern world rushed past. Cars, television broadcasts, jet aircraft overhead. A world increasingly shaped by technologies that exceeded their creators' original intentions. Letters from his nephew Paul, now a career officer serving with Belgian forces in various international deployments, provided a soldier's perspective on the weapon's real-world performance. Paul wrote from Cyprus in 1964, "Uncle Dieudonné, the rifle serves us well in this complicated peacekeeping mission. Both Greek and Turkish forces respect its capabilities, which sometimes prevents conflicts from escalating. But I have seen your design carried by men whose causes I question, and I wonder how you feel about this strange legacy. The question haunted Saif more deeply than Paul could have known. In quiet evening hours, when the factory fell silent and he remained alone with his thoughts, Saif grappled with the fundamental paradox of his achievement. He had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams in creating a weapon that democratized military effectiveness. Any army with sufficient resources could now field rifles equal to those carried by superpowers. But democratizing military technology meant empowering any regime willing to pay, regardless of their commitment to the democratic values that had inspired the original design. The rifle that was supposed to tip the balance toward freedom had simply raised the stakes for everyone. Henri Moreau, now elderly and preparing for retirement, found Saif working late one evening in November 1968, surrounded by news clippings and correspondence from military attachés around the world. "You're brooding again, Dieudonné." "I'm calculating, Henri, trying to understand the mathematics of responsibility." "And what have you concluded?" Saif gestured to the scattered papers, reports of FAL rifles in the hands of South American juntas, African strongmen, Asian autocrats, and liberation movements that might become tomorrow's oppressors. "I concluded that engineering equations are simpler than moral ones. When you design a gas-operated rifle, the physics are predictable. When you release it into the world, human nature becomes the variable you cannot control. Would you change anything, knowing what you know now?" Saif considered the question while finishing his coffee, noting again the familiar bitter taste that connected him to memories of occupation, liberation, and the dreams that had driven his work through those crucial years after the war. "I would change the world that requires such weapons, Henri. But since I cannot change the world, I must live with having armed it more effectively." The conversation echoed in Saif's mind as 1968 became 1969, as student protests erupted across Europe and America, as the Cold War deepened and proxy conflicts proliferated. His rifle had become a constant presence in global affairs, carried by forces representing every point on the political spectrum. The right arm of the free world had become simply another tool of human ambition, as morally neutral as the steel from which it was forged. What do you do when you realize your greatest success has become something you never intended it to be? Yet success carried its own burden. In 1970, as Saif entered retirement, he watched television footage of his creation being used in conflicts he never could have imagined. The rifle designed to defend Western democracy was arming both sides of African civil wars, both liberators and oppressors in South American coups. The right arm of the free world had become simply another tool of human violence, as morally neutral as the steel from which it was forged. The revelation that would forever change how Saif understood his life's work came through an unexpected source. Dr. Elizabeth Rousseau visited him at his small retirement apartment in December 1970, carrying a worn leather portfolio that she placed carefully on his kitchen table beside his ever-present coffee cup. "I debated whether to show you this, Mr. Saif, but I believe you have the right to know." Inside the portfolio were photographs, letters, and medical reports from Red Cross missions across Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. But these weren't routine documentation. They were testimonies of how the FAL had performed in the hands of child soldiers, guerrilla forces, and government troops engaged in systematic oppression. "This photograph was taken in Biafra," Dr. Rousseau explained quietly. "The boy is perhaps 12 years old. The rifle he carries is one of yours, supplied by a government that recruited children to fight their civil war." Saif studied the image with growing horror. The child's eyes stared back at him across an impossible distance, dark, serious, ancient in a face that should have been concerned with schoolbooks and games. The rifle in the boy's small hands was unmistakably an FAL, and it was nearly as tall as its young bearer. We encountered him at a checkpoint outside Lagos. He had been carrying this rifle for 8 months, had been trained to operate it with mechanical precision, but had no understanding of the conflict he was fighting or the causes he supposedly served. More photographs followed. A mass grave in Guatemala where civilians had been executed by troops carrying FALs, a torture center in a country he couldn't pronounce where his rifles had been modified with bayonets specifically designed for intimidation. Medical reports describing wounds that could only have been inflicted by weapons designed for precise, professional use, but wielded instead by forces that recognized no professional restraints. The rifle's very effectiveness makes it valuable to any group with political ambitions, regardless of their methods, Dr. Rousseau continued. Its reliability means it functions perfectly in the hands of disciplined armies and undisciplined militias alike. Saif set down his coffee cup with shaking hands. The bitter ersatz taste that had comforted him for 25 years now seemed appropriate. Harsh, unforgiving, a reminder of harsh realities that comfortable assumptions could not sweeten. How many children? We estimate several thousand at minimum. The rifle's durability and simple maintenance requirements make it ideal for irregular forces that cannot provide extensive training or technical support. The terrible irony was inescapable. Saif had designed the FAL to be soldier-proof, reliable enough for conscripts, simple enough for troops with minimal technical education, robust enough to function under the worst possible conditions. Those same qualities that made it perfect for NATO armies also made it perfect for any group that wanted to put weapons in untrained hands. The portfolio contained one final document, a letter written by a Belgian peacekeeping officer stationed in the Congo. Saif recognized the handwriting immediately, his nephew Paul. Uncle Dieudonné, Paul had written, "I am sending this through Dr. Rousseau because I cannot write these words in a letter to family. Yesterday our unit confiscated weapons from a local militia group. Among them were dozens of FALs, your design, your creation, but these weapons had been modified in ways that horrify me. Barrel lengths altered for concealment, stocks shortened for child soldiers, firing mechanisms simplified to eliminate safety features. Your brilliant engineering has been perverted by men who understand violence, but not honor." The letter continued. "I remember you telling me that engineering was about solving problems, about making things work better than before. But I have learned that some problems cannot be solved by better engineering. They can only be made more efficient. Your rifle works perfectly. That is both its greatest achievement and its most terrible legacy." Saif sat in silence for several minutes after Dr. Rousseau finished reading. Outside his window, the lights of Liège twinkled in the winter darkness. The same view he had known as a child, when his greatest ambition was to understand how machines worked and perhaps make them work a little better. "What does one do with knowledge like this?" he finally asked. "One bears witness," Dr. Rousseau replied. "One acknowledges the full truth of what has been created, and one decides how to carry that knowledge for whatever years remain." That night, Saif sat alone with his thoughts and his bitter coffee, confronting the central secret that would define his final years. The rifle he had created to arm democracy had armed the world, without discrimination, without moral judgment, without the naive optimism that had driven its creation. His greatest engineering success had become his most profound moral challenge. What would you do if you discovered that your life's greatest achievement had unintended consequences you could never undo? The old gunsmith understood what history rarely acknowledges, that genius is often indistinguishable from tragedy, that the mind behind the weapon must live forever with the consequences of its creation. He had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams, arming half the world with Belgian engineering, proving that a small nation could shape global events through innovation and determination. The final years of Saiva's life were marked by a quiet pilgrimage of conscience. He began corresponding with historians, peace researchers, and ethicists who sought to understand the moral complexity of weapons development in the 20th century. His small apartment became an informal archive where visitors could find not just technical drawings and patents, but also the letters from Dr. Rousseau, the photographs of child soldiers, and his own careful documentation of how good intentions could produce unexpected consequences. Professor James Mitchell from Oxford University visited in 1973, researching a book about the relationship between technological innovation and moral responsibility. He found Saiva, now 85, still drinking Azat's coffee from the same metal cup he had used throughout the rifle's development. "Do you regret creating the FAL?" Professor Mitchell asked directly. Saiv considered the question while watching steam rise from his coffee, the bitter aroma carrying him back through decades of memory. The workshop in winter 1947, the first successful test, the pride of solving problems that had defeated better-funded competitors. "I regret that the world needed such a weapon," he answered finally. "I regret that human beings require increasingly efficient methods of killing one another. But I cannot regret pursuing engineering excellence, even when that excellence serves purposes beyond my control or intention." Some of your contemporaries have expressed guilt about their military innovations. Guilt assumes one could have chosen differently with the same knowledge available at the time. In 1947, I believed I was creating a tool to defend democracy against totalitarianism. That belief was sincere and, within the context of that historical moment, rational. The fact that the tool later served different masters reflects the complexity of human nature, not a failure of engineering judgment. Professor Mitchell pressed further. "But knowing what you know now, about child soldiers and dictatorships armed with your creation, how do you find peace?" Saiv set down his coffee cup and walked to the window overlooking the Meuse River, where barges carried cargo through the industrial landscape that had shaped his childhood and career. The view had changed remarkably little since his youth. The same river, the same hills, the same rhythm of work and weather that had sustained this region through wars and peace, occupation and liberation. Peace comes from acknowledging the full truth, not just the comfortable portions. My rifle has killed innocent people, armed oppressive regimes, and enabled conflicts I deplore. It has also defended democratic societies, protected peacekeepers, and deterred aggressors who might otherwise have calculated that freedom was defenseless. These are both true simultaneously. The engineer's task is to hold both truths without denying either. The conversation continued into the evening, touching on themes that would define how Saiv's legacy would be remembered by future generations. He spoke about the democratization of military technology, about the moral weight carried by inventors whose creations outlive their original purposes, and about the stubborn hope that human beings might eventually develop wisdom to match their technical capabilities. In the end, Dieudonné Saiv died quietly in 1974, largely unknown outside the circles of professional soldiers and gun collectors. But his legacy lived on in the distinctive profile of the FAL, in the democratic principle that the best design should win regardless of its origin, in the proof that sometimes the most profound revolutions come from the most unexpected hands. His nephew Paul, now a colonel nearing his own retirement, attended the small funeral service and spoke briefly about his uncle's character. He was a man who listened to metal speaking its secrets, who solved problems that defeated larger minds and better-funded laboratories. But in his final years, he also listened to his conscience speaking truths that were harder to bear than any engineering challenge. He carried both burdens with equal integrity. Dr. Elizabeth Rousseau was among the few mourners who understood the full complexity of what had been lost. After the service, she found herself holding Saiva's old coffee cup, the one constant companion through decades of creation and consequence. He never stopped drinking that terrible ersatz coffee, she mentioned to Paul. He said it reminded him that bitter truths were more useful than sweet illusions, Paul replied, that a man should taste reality clearly even when reality was difficult to swallow. Years later, military historians would debate Saiv's place in the pantheon of weapons designers, comparing his achievements to those of Kalashnikov, Browning, and Garand. But the more thoughtful analyses would note that Saiv's true innovation was not merely technical, it was moral. He had demonstrated that an inventor could acknowledge the full consequences of creation without abandoning the pursuit of excellence, could bear witness to unintended outcomes without retreating into denial or defensive justification. The FAL continued to serve in dozens of armies long after Saiv's death, gradually replaced by newer designs but never entirely disappearing from global arsenals. Occasionally, news reports would mention its presence in distant conflicts, and those who knew the history might remember the Belgian gunsmith who had listened to metal speaking its needs and created something that changed the world more than he ever intended. In a small museum in Liège, visitors can still see Saiv's workshop, preserved much as he left it in 1970. The metal coffee cup sits on the workbench beside his tools and blueprints, a reminder that even the most transformative innovations begin with simple human needs, for recognition, for purpose, for the satisfaction of solving problems that others deemed impossible. The bitter taste of ersatz coffee, the sound of steel against steel, the weight of consequences extending far beyond intention, these became the true legacy of a man whose genius lay not just in creation, but in the courage to face honestly what he had created. If this story reminded you that even in the darkest times, small acts of humanity still matter, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story. What taste lingers longer? The bitterness of difficult truths, or the memory of purposes that once seemed pure?